Hello, thank you again for joining me on this journey through the Bible. We're taking a look at the Bible and we're taking a look at the church and all that God has to tell us, all the way from the very beginning in Genesis, all the way to the very end in Revelation. Then we're even going to go a little bit farther beyond. We're even going to look at what has happened after the end of the first century up until today. So we have gone through the introduction and we've done first three lessons. The first lesson, we looked at creation. We looked at the Bible. What is important? What is different about it? We found out that there in our introduction, our first thing we must do is to answer the question, is there a God? What is God? Who is God? Why the Bible? What's important about the Bible? Establishing that there is something special about this book is the basis for what we start with. Because we go into Genesis and we start right there at the very beginning, which is a good place to start. It gives us good groundwork. And we see that there in the beginning, God created. And this is where we talked about in our intro, is the fact that, okay, who was God? God was the one who created. We can either see that we just happen to be, or if we take a look around at all the evidences in the world today, our DNA, the fact of our seasons, where we've been and how we're getting to where we're going, we can see that, and we take a look at just nature itself, we can see that there is intelligent design involved in this world that we live in. It couldn't have just happened. The ability to come up with that kind of creation or existence just is too overwhelmingly impossible. You can't put chemicals into a blender and end up with a baby. It's not going to happen. And so we can see that intelligent design is one of the very basic things that we need. And we know right there in Genesis, one of the things that we pointed out is 5 things that are needed and are right there in the first verse of the book of Genesis. The beginning, that means time. Then there's God and the force created the energy, the heavens, that's the space, and the earth, that's the matter. And so you've got those 5 elements that are used, and they're right there at the very beginning of the book. And we know that it has to be something that is unique, because even science today has no way of reduplicating it, being able to produce it. It's nothing that any of us witnessed. So it is something that remains a mystery for anyone except those who believe that God was there creating. God created us, because he's the only one that can create something from nothing, and to do it in an intelligent way. And as we looked at the creation, we found out the fall of man there in the garden ended up bringing about the separation from God. You know, that's the one most precious thing God has given us, is that of choice. Man is the one thing that we've been given that differentiates us from all the other species on this world. And they all operate on instinct. We have choice. We can choose. And we base our choices on the information that our brains manage to accumulate. And we know that those choices, along with that freedom of choice, comes responsibility as well as consequences. Make a good choice, you get some good consequences. Bad choice, you're going to get some bad consequences. And we've all made both good and bad. And God knew, giving us that freedom, that we'd occasionally make some bad choices. And he had it from the beginning in his plan of how he could deal with us making some of those bad choices and removing them, removing the consequences, because the consequence of making a wrong choice and basically sin can be looked at as missing the mark. Sin can be looked at as something that has gone against what God has directed. All comes on back. Yes, we fall short. Romans 3, find out all men have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. We're not gods. We're in the image of God, but we're not. And we looked at then Cain, who ended up out of jealousy, killing his brother Abel. And we ended up going through the flood, because as people separated from God, they got so wicked, much in the way of Cain, that God decided that he'd have to put an end to all the wickedness. And what did he do? He found 8 people, Noah and his family, but the only ones who were righteous, the only ones who were willing to listen to what God had to tell them. And he saved them. He cleansed the world with water. He saved 8. And he ended up removing the wickedness by water. Water is what we saw there in 2 Peter, that water that Noah went through is very much like baptism, water, a grave that we go through to be a Christian. And so with the end of the flood, that is where we left off. And we're coming into the fact that we're getting close to being able to learn about the very next most important person in the Bible, and that would be Abraham. So I'm going to bring up our screen, and there we have that. We see that after the flood, and this is the screen we left off with last time, after the flood, having spent more than a year in the ark, Noah and his family were finally able to set foot on dry ground. And the rebuilding of mankind was to start. Noah offered a sacrifice to God, and God sent a rainbow in the sky as a sign that he would never again destroy all men with water. However, at the end of time, we know he will destroy it with fire. In previous lessons, we looked at the scriptures that told us about that. And we know that there in Genesis 9:11, this is where God makes that statement. I established my covenant with you that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. That was God's promise to Noah, and the rainbow in the sky gives us that sign of God's promise there. God has never hidden the truth from man. He is also incapable of lying. There in Hebrews 6:18 is impossible. That's the one thing that's impossible. God has something that he's impossible for him to do. It is impossible for him to lie. He is truth. God is truth. God is spirit. And yes, lying, God doesn't lie. He takes his promises, his words, very seriously. It would be so nice if man could end up doing that. But we don't. But because we're not true to our word does not mean that God's not true to his. God is true to his. Because we know that there are many evidences of the flood in excavations, unearthing artifacts, also marine fossils and historical legends of Egyptians, Chaldeans, Greeks, and even Mexicans, and South Sea Islanders. The accuracy of the Bible has been proven over and over. No book has proven more true than the Bible. So after Noah, this is where we start to learn about Abraham. Before Abraham, after the flood, man once again turned from God and looked to what they could do as a people rather than what God wanted them. Why do I say that? Why is it that evident? Because they tried to build a tower to make a name for themselves. This was the building of the Tower of Babel. God wanted them to fill the earth, and they wanted to build a city, but they wanted to build a city so as not to be dispersed over the face of the earth. So God confused their language and they scattered. That's in Genesis 11, 4 through 9, that story of the Tower of Babel. And we know right there in the beginning chapters of Genesis where Adam and Eve were created. They're in Genesis 2, the end of Genesis 2, start of Genesis 3. So where God told Adam and Eve, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, bring it into submission. God designed man to where he could go on out and he had the world to end up learning from, being able to be challenged with all aspects of life and all aspects of his creation. He gave them that freedom to roam the whole world. He told them to be fruitful and multiply. He wanted them to spread on out, not just bundle together. But there, right after the flood, after all that Noah and his family gone through, it wasn't long before man forgot about God and decided they wanted to do their own thing. Now, Abraham was counted by God, not counted as righteous by God, not because he was sinless, but because he believed God. That's Galatians 3:6. That will tell us that. And it was 9 generations after the flood that Abraham and Isaac entered Bible history. Abraham was a faithful believer in God. When God asked him to go to a land that he would show him, Abraham faithfully went. God made a promise to bless all the nations of the earth through his seed. Yeah, his seed, in other words, his children. That promised seed was Christ. That is told us in Galatians 3:16. It's amazing how God sets his own time frame. We know that when it came there in the very first part, his creation, he did what he created, did in 6 days. And yet, that doesn't fit our time frame, but it fit his. And the time frame. How long until Noah? There's quite a few generations. And after Noah, to where we are now, 9 generations. After 9 generations, he found someone faithful to him that he was ready to go and show a land of promise. And that was to Abraham. And what was it that he promised? He promised that all the nations would be blessed through his seed, his offspring. Christ is one of his offspring. Right in the lineage of Christ is Abraham. God's promise to Abraham was renewed on several occasions. Abraham had started his journey when he was 75. When he was 99, God finally blessed Abraham and Sarah with a child. That's quite a long time. And to be that old, 99, we think of that now. I mean, just to even start moving, pick up and move to some new place at 75. Most of us, like me, retired. Hopefully we're settled. We have learned that God will destroy the earth with fire in the end. Do you believe that? Or do we laugh? I wonder whether or not. Why laugh? Well, Abraham and Sarah thought they were past the age of childbearing. Sarah first laughed when she heard she was to have a child because she was almost 100 years old. Can you imagine today? Our oldest birth record that I know of, if I remember correctly, in the book of Guinness of World Records, is 65 years old. And here she was 99 years old. That's in Genesis 18:14. And that's where, when talking to Abraham, and it says, is anything too hard for the Lord? At the appointed time, I will return to you. And about this time next year, and Sarah will have a son. Sarah laughed. She heard that and laughed. And when we come on down and we hear that God will destroy the earth with fire in the end, do we laugh? God sets his own time frame. Are we prepared for that day? God didn't tell us the exact day. Here, He says, at the appointed time I'll return to you, and at this time next year, you'll have a son. Didn't say what day, but at this time the next year, when he returned, that son would be. Well, we know that when Christ returns, that is when the earth will be burned up. Again, are we prepared for that day? Noah was given instructions on how it was that he could save him and his family through the impending flood. Have you learned enough now? Do you understand? Can you see what it is that you might need to do in order to be prepared for that day when God comes back to destroy the earth with fire? If not, continue listening. I'm sure we'll hit upon it again. How are we to prepare for that day? That's what we're going to end up as we go through these lessons. You will be able to tie it all together, and you'll see from the very beginning all the way to the end, God has had a plan, and he has it out there for all of us to end up knowing just what it is that he wants and what it is that we should do. There, once Sarah had a baby. That baby was Isaac. And like Abraham's wife, Sarah, Isaac's wife, Rebekah, was unable to bear children for a long time. Isaac pleaded with God, and God blessed them with two sons, Jacob and Esau. They're in Genesis 25:21. Both Abraham and Isaac had a slow start to fulfilling the promise to Abraham that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars and the sands of the sea. You can imagine, yes, it took them a while. Abraham, the promised seed, was 100 years old. Isaac, he too. Before Abraham was going to have grandchildren, Isaac was going along quite well in age before he had his first son. Jacob, one of Isaac's sons, eventually became the father of 12 sons. Now we're starting to see how that multiplies, and we can understand how families grow. It only takes one or two children before all of a sudden it multiplies, and you're going to have a big family. And so we can see that, yes, God blessed Abraham, blessed Isaac. Now he's even blessed Jacob, who's got 12 sons. And of that, Joseph was one of them that became one of the best known men of the Bible. So we're going to see that Joseph, we spend a little bit of time here looking at the life of Joseph and just what it is that he has done. Joseph was the firstborn of Jacob's beloved wife, Rachel. Jacob was partial to Joseph and gave him a coat of many colors. His older brothers were jealous of him. Despite his troubled life, Joseph found happiness in his deep faith in the Heavenly Father. Now, Joseph was the firstborn of his beloved wife, Rachel. He had his first 10 sons since there's older brothers. Yes, there were 10 older brothers that he had through Leah, which would have been Rachel's sister. And so he ended up having 12 sons, 2 by Rachel. And Rachel ended up having Joseph. And Joseph, he developed a deep faith in God. And we're going to see where that faith leads him. Because Joseph had a dream, and then he went on a journey. So when young, Joseph had a dream that his brothers would bow down to him. These dreams only increased the brothers' envy of him. Later we'll see these predictions fulfilled as these dreams were God's revelation to Joseph. They're in Genesis 35 or 37. I'm going to read those verses 5 through 14. As it tells us the story of his dream, and then it's going to tell us about how Joseph's brothers reacted to him telling him about that dream. So if you've got your Bible and you want to follow along, again, it's in Genesis chapter 37. And I'm going to start with verse 5. And again, I'll read through 11, tells us all about his dream. And then in 12 through 14, tell us about how his brothers reacted to that. There in verse 5, it says, "Now Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, 'Hear this dream that I have dreamed. Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, And behold, my sheaves arose and stood upright. And behold, your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf. His brothers said to him, Are you indeed to reign over us? Or are you indeed to rule over us? So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Isn't it amazing how they end up being jealous? Of which, yeah, I've felt jealousy before. My sister, two brothers. I understand that aspect. Not enough to do what happened later. I'm going to continue because he had another dream. It says, Then he dreamed another dream and told it to his brothers and said, Behold, I had dreamed another dream. Behold, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me. But when he told it to his father and to his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow ourselves to the ground before you? And his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the saying in his mind. Isn't that more of a proper reaction? Instead of being jealous, realize, okay, somebody's telling you something, but is it affecting you right then? If it isn't, who knows? Let it go, because you never know. And what happens if it is true? But as we continue on, there in 12 through 14, this is what jealousy ended up leading his brothers to do to him. Now his brothers went to pasture their father's flock near Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, Are not your brothers pasturing the flock at Shechem? Come, I will send you to them. And he said to him, Here I am. So he said to him, Go now, see if it is well with your brothers and with the flock, and bring me word. So he sent him from the valley of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. And a man found him wandering in the fields. And the man said to him, What are you seeking? He says, I am seeking my brothers, he said. Tell me, please, tell me where they pasturing the flock. And the man said, They have gone away, for I heard them say, Let us go to Dothan. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. And we know that they sat down and they sold him. They threw him in a hole, and then they sold him into slavery. So at 17, he was 17 years old when they did that to him. Sold him into slavery, and his father would not see Joseph for 22 years. The slave traders took him to Egypt, and this began Joseph's climb to power as second in command to Pharaoh. What happened at home and in Egypt? Genesis 37, 17 through 35 tells a story of betrayal and deception. We read a little bit about that. Joseph's brothers had sold him into slavery, and now they would lie to their father Jacob that Joseph might have been killed by a wild beast. For years, Jacob mourned Joseph's death, thinking that since he had sent him to his brother, he was at fault for not having him go with somebody else for protection. But how would you deal with being sold into slavery? That is a real struggle for most people. We like our freedom. For us to be sold into slavery would really put us at a loss. It's hard to understand how to deal with being somebody else's property. We like to be treated as human, as a person, as a being, as somebody of value. But Joseph, he was sold to Potiphar, the captain of the guard. Joseph impressed him enough to be placed in charge of Pharaoh's financial affairs. Things went well until Potiphar's wife fell in love with Joseph. Everyone knows how that happens. She accused Joseph of making advances toward her, and Potiphar believed his wife and had Joseph thrown into prison. What do you think? Husband and wife, going to believe the wife, or are you going to believe somebody, some friend of years. The wife usually has the precedence. Just like a wife will usually understand that a husband, unless they have some doubts. But that is one thing that Joseph had to face. And how do most react to false charges? He actually ran. Potiphar's wife made advances to him, and he was the one that ran away. So Potiphar's wife, being rejected, told her husband that Joseph had made the advances because she still had his coat when he fled. That was one thing she had taken from him, was his coat. He let go of the coat and ran. And so she said it was Joseph that attacked her. Got him thrown into prison. And so when we pick up, we're going to find out what happens to Joseph while he's in prison. Because in prison, things happen in his favor. Because why? He's drawn close to God, his faith. His faith has managed to make a bad situation turn into something good. We know that God works in his own time, and he works through people who are faithful servants to him. God can work through any one of us. God definitely, we can see next time how he worked with Joseph. And if we end up putting God's will ahead of ours, God will also work with us. So again, we will pick up with what happens to Joseph while he is in prison. I hope you'll join me next time as we pick up our journey through the Bible and we move on to lesson number 4. Thank you.